Good morning, thank you. Wow, that got really loud, didn't it? Can everybody hear okay in the back? I'll try not to wander around too much. Stan called and invited and said he had a small group of people he wanted to talk to for a few minutes. Said, okay, I'm used to doing that. That'll be fine. But it is actually good to know your audience. So, show of hands, who all is a county assessor or in the county assessor's office? So the bulk. Okay. How many Farm Bureau folks? Pretty big showing. How many appraisers, farmers on the boards? Okay. How many reporters?
Good.
All right, so we can talk freely. Good. No, and it's about 10:30. There's a clock on the back, about 10:40. If we want to break to live TV at 11 o'clock, Donald Trump is apparently making an announcement at the U of I today. Or I mean, the athletic director. So I think the message will be similar. But this, thanks for accommodating this time too. You asked a couple of weeks ago, and it just wasn't going to fit into a schedule because we're in the middle of the semester and the students are really starting to, engage in the classes. And, I don't always get this kind of attendance on my Friday afternoon classes, by the way. So, but by this point in the time in the semester, they're really, engaged in their coursework and really dedicated, and then things like unofficial happen and you got to start all over building it up again. But this was the first open day, so sorry for the couple-week delay I think this may have caused. Okay, what we want to talk about today is really the assessment process. There are some outcomes of the process that you may or may not like, but I think, Stan, the charge was to make sure people felt at least comfortable understanding where the numbers come from, right? So you get some information every year when the assessment process kind of gets the handle of the crank turned again, and you have to go through some problems. And people often call back, and Brenda, just for clarification, they said this was about a 15-minute talk for me, but they held an hour and 15 minutes, or an hour and a half, so I assume the remainder is for IDOR. So, but to understand how those numbers get generated and maybe some background, I just want to go through some materials. And talk about preaching to the choir. I apologize in some sense for this slide, because it's something you all know very well. But the current law and its modifications began in 1981. Excuse me. There have been some minor updates through time that adjust how the law is done, and there's some predecessor laws to that. But the most important thing is that it adopts use valuation, and use valuation is a principle used throughout almost all of the Midwest. Use valuation says the following. Farmland generates a certain amount of income, and whether it was higher valued because of development potential or whatever else, we're still going to tax it based on the amount of income it can generate. So this principle is in place in a wide part of the U.S. There are very different ways people do it. Indiana uses one particular form of a cash rent and a corn base. Iowa uses a crop suitability rating and a corn version of that. Ohio uses a third version, Wisconsin. So there are different forms of this, but all of them are targeting using an income measure and then capitalizing the income to find out what the value of the asset would be in use in terms of the income it generates rather than its market value. It's considered in that sense preferential to market value. Thank you. I have one. Been in front of a lot of people this week. My apologies for partial voice. Excuse me. It's tied to the productivity index schedule and uses what would be considered prevalent crop rotations, not specific crop rotations in a particular location or parcel, to calculate what the income potential should be. A really quick analogy may help understand what's going on there. If I'm a landlord and I have a building and I choose not to rent it out, my income could be zero. So it's not my particular income that they would use to tax my property. It's the income I should have been able to make under normal practices, right? So that same principle applies to farmland. This idea that we normalize on the productivity of the soil, normalize for the rotations we expect, normalize on prices, and average through time on prices is to create an index potential that's considered fair and in the middle. If you happen to be a phenomenal operator and always double the income of your neighbor, should your property tax be twice as high? Probably not. So the principle implied in the law there is to come up with a good way of measuring what the income potential should be for soils of that type in that location in the window of time that it's being observed. Okay? The 5-year rolling window was chosen Back in the late 70s and early 80s, price volatility may be higher now. Perhaps if we were rewriting the law, we would choose a different window or a different way of averaging, but 5 years was thought of as the right period of time to more or less keep things from moving too quickly and average through time against year-to-year variation in conditions. The original definitions, I'll put this out front early on and up in front. No government payments are considered. So in the 80s, government payments were tied to issues like set-aside, and land that wasn't in production would have roughly generated about the same amount of income, perhaps, that land in production was. So this idea was it was a bit more of a wash. The commodity programs have changed substantially through time, as you all know. But government program payments are simply omitted from the calculation of what the income potential is. Later on in the process, and Farm Bureau folks with longer institutional memories may want to help on this. At a date when it looked like property taxes could continue to go down for a while, when there were some lesser ag incomes, counties asked for some protection, and a 10% limitation on the rate of decline in assessments was implemented. At the same time, to prevent the upward movement of the same magnitude, a 10% increase was implemented. It is actually somewhat important to recognize that those changes in the applications were done after the original law was written. These are modifications or additions to the process, and I think we need to think about them very separately. So I'll have a lot more to say about the 10% limit later. And then another implementation detail that may matter because it's different than some neighboring states, it's done on a PI by PI basis. So you have to find what the PI is of the soil and then calculate a lot of information to find out what the income potential would be for that particular PI'd soil. Now, a PI of 120 that's growing a lot of corn 4 miles from an ethanol plant might generate more income than a PI of 120 way up in the corner of the state where you can't plant as early, might have to harvest earlier, and so on. So there are some differences from what you would think of as the actual local income potential. The economic productivity index that we calculate at the U of I reflects basis differences and time of harvest and planting and so on. This is not an economic productivity index. This is a soils-based productivity index. So a 120 in the north is a 120 in the south. That's kind of a critical issue. Okay. Okay. After the income potential is calculated, it's capitalized by the 2032A rate. The 2032A rate is a number that comes out of the tax code, section 2032A, that is used for valuing businesses transferred generally generation to generation in estate issues. It has some other applications. Technically, it can be used for special use valuation in other cases. But it's calculated as the location-specific farm credit territory average rate over the previous 5 years of new mortgage money originated. Whew, those are a lot of words, right? What it is the average mortgage rate from farm credit, okay, in the area over a long period of time, or over a 5-year window of time. There's some very strange details about timing on this and when they release it and when the year that it's applied to happened. And if you recall last year when we had no estate tax kind of window for a year, they failed to publish it. Okay, so sometimes you have to actually go calculate what it would be, and then fortunately we guessed right. IRS had to release a ruling this year for last year's estate tax returns that in fact confirmed we got the right number. But this is just like saying, what's the permanent income value of $1? So if I was going to give you $1 a year forever, how much would you pay for that promise today? Well, if you had a 5% discount rate, you would think about it like, well, if I put that in the bank, 5%, 5 cents a year, divide, okay, so that's worth 20 bucks, that permanent income. So the same idea is happening when we capitalize with the 2032A rate to come up with the implied value on use of the agricultural parcel. That AUV is divided by 3 to come up with an equalized assessed value. My own sidebar editorial, I don't have any idea why we divide the assessed values instead of the rates by 3, but this is the practice we use in property taxation, so just like everything else, divided by 3, get an EAV. Switch here. Then the EAV changes are limited to 10% up or down annually at each point on the PI scale. Now this is a very ambiguous passage in the code, frankly. If you read it and you have 10 lawyers read it, you come up with 11 different opinions on what it means. The limits should be really simple. If I said nothing can move more than 10%, you immediately think that that's a pretty clean way of restricting some change, right? But Stan, if you gave me a 10% a bonus on the amount you're paying me today, how much more would you spend? 0, right? Okay, so the problem is going to be, what you're going to see is the 10% limit. You can cut my fee in half, in fact, if you'd like to. The 10% limit has a very differential effect at low ends on the PI scale than it does at high ends on the PI scale. And as everything else is changing through time, that affects where the limits are binding at different points in time. And again, I know I said this is a really simple idea. I know that's a very hard thing to appreciate until we see pictures, so just kind of hold on to that thought as one of the important ones for later on. And points on the PI scale lower than the lowest cropped land have a straight line relationship. Instead of estimating this at every single point, which turns out to be a bit of a curve, when you get down to that last number that's cropped, you just stretch a straight line from that down to the lowest PI for the remainder and just calculate the numbers on a straight line. And finally, about 4 years ago, maybe I'm getting older faster than I recall, we moved to a soils weighted basis for implementing this as opposed to a parcel level. And the point of that is there are a lot of curves involved, and when you take averages on curves, you don't necessarily get the middle of the curve as a kind of an odd way to think about this. But rather than calculating the average PI at the parcel first and then calculating the tax, calculate the tax on each PI and then weight those. It comes up with slightly different numbers. That's a better approach, by the way. Okay, and obviously applies to cropland, pasture, and farmland. Does not, on a PI basis, apply to wasteland. And wooded lands is a completely different story, and those of you who participated in this will understand why I said it's not a particularly satisfying story. You get to the end there, and it was a very politically charged decision, so those of you who also have to implement it for wooded lands, my apologies. The soil classification is largely a Sergo system or an NRCS system. The U of I has converted it through time to 2 major publications because they extended. Ken Olson's done a nice job of adding information around the PI. So we have a nationally understood mechanism for rating soils. What Ken has added is additional information about what it should do in various forms of management for different kinds of practices and different crops. So we have a lot of detail and use Bulletin 810 versions of the PI. Used to use what was called Circular 1156, but we've added 90-some soil classifications in the state, I believe. Maybe off on that number, but we've added a lot of soils and done a lot better detail on getting the PIs associated with particular soils, and then the better soil surveys allow us to designate pretty accurately the number of acres in any parcel of each soil type. Oops. Okay, and again, this is old news to you. The way it works, of course, is that there's quite a lag built in from a lot of reasons. So we take the data from a 5-year window prior to the year that we're doing the calculation, which is prior to the year that the tax is paid. And so the window of the block of data used for calculating the assessed values keeps rolling forward 1 year at a time. So in 2000, we used a 5-year window, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's not the difference in the dates. To calculate the information in 05, which meant the tax bills that were paid in 06 for assessments in 05 used 04 through 2000 data. So there can be a very long and slow change in the values. So one of the things that is often perplexing to people is, wow, we had great incomes this year. We had really high prices. Why didn't they change in the direction we expected? Or we had a decline in prices. Well, because it's not based on just this 1 year event. It's based on a long rolling window. And next year I got a surprise. Well, it's because next year reflects the bills from calculation this year, which were the previous. So you get the point. There is a line in the code that refers to the use of what would be considered independently arrived at values at the University of Illinois, and the version of those data used at the University of Illinois are from the Farm Business Farm Management Record Keeping System. That is the gold standard. It is without a doubt the best record keeping system in the US. All the states around are always trying to imitate it. Chris can comment on it. It's true, it's the gold standard. It is the best record-keeping system. Just under 6,000 real farms effectively in it, a lot of acres, a lot of accounting detail, better than tax quality records, and certified means that it has to add up through time. So this isn't my opinion, I can convert from a cash to accrual basis, I can do my taxes out of this. It's a good system, okay? The non-land costs can't always be attributed to particular crop activities. So if I have a fertilizer bill, how much of it was corn and soybeans? We don't keep track of it quite that way. We keep track of a lot of additional details on an enterprise basis. Some of the details, how much does it cost me to own my buildings? What's my labor charge for unpaid family? Details that are really complex are done in the best way possible. They weren't built to serve the tax code, okay? So the accounting data in FBFM, in fact, are far better than is required by the way the law requires us to use some data to come up with these non-land costs and gross levels. The gross return, we'll talk about the formula a little bit in more detail, has just millions, literally, of calculations in it, okay? For every acre, the PI is calculated. For that acre, the crop rotations for corn, soybeans, wheat, sorghum, grain, sorghum, oats, hay, and previous to a few years ago, a couple other crops, the fractions are calculated for that. The average prices for all 60 prior months are calculated of the commodity or the use of the product, are calculated and averaged. Those are multiplied together and put on a per acre basis. The per acre basis is converted to an operator acre basis. Got all this? Okay. So the steps are, we actually come up with an index of the amount of income that acre would be able to produce if it were the average acre in its PI class for that year. Okay. The yield functions are adjusted for time. This is something that wasn't always done. It's been a standardized process now and works pretty well now. And as FBFM has complied with GAAP changes and requirements for tax in particular, we've largely made commensurate changes in the data we use out of FBFM, but there's never been a case where they've gotten worse. They've always just been more detail. So they'll go to enterprise accounting and go to management accounting systems on top of their old data. Okay. Just a little bit more about, I kind of got ahead of myself, roughly 2,600 records per year times 5 years is a lot of farms. And there are a lot of different PIs at each farm. And we can put them together into something at each location. And the operated acre basis is really important to appreciate. On an operated acre basis, we keep track of lease types. So 50-50 share on 100 acres counts as 50 operated acres. 50 acres owned counts as 50 acres, okay? So I'll have an example of that later as well. But the point of that is we can actually associate cost side data better with the actual production data if we do this on an operated acre basis. And again, yields are standardized at an 8-10 scale to adjust for time. As I said before, good or bad management around practices doesn't affect the income potential. Might affect the income. If you just, you plant some crazy, we had on my home farm in Ohio, we had somebody try to sell us crabgrass one year for waterways because it was really good at keeping erosion down. Fortunately, we declined to plant that crop. But had we, it wouldn't have, and we had no crops the next year in the next acre on each side of the waterway, we wouldn't have gotten a reduction in property taxes for making a bad decision, okay? So that's an important feature in this. You can see this is just a screenshot of one little part of a utility. Plug in the year, plug in the PI, and it gives you the predicted for that location yields. Hay is in tons, of course. The rest are in bushels. Okay, now crop rotations on a statewide basis, they don't change much year to year. Now at a farm and in a parcel they do. They change every year quite often. A little more corn on corn, but all we've seen is from 2000 to 2010 we've only gained about 7%. This is smaller than I expected. Before I did this set of calculations I thought we may be up 15%. Soybeans, the other big complement crop, everything else is rounding error. But the law says you reflect this, so we do. We keep track of all these details all the way out, including sorghum, which has another couple of zeros before you get to a real digit. We still do all the calculations. So. What about prices? This screen takes a little more time to appreciate, and I know it's not intended that you can pick out the particular numbers, especially from the back on this screen, but the color coding is kind of important. This is just corn. We do the same process for each of the crops. Oats is a little different because of the way marketing services keeps track of oat prices. But for each year, we keep track of the monthly farm prices received and come up with an average in the year. The years are then averaged in these 5-year blocks. So this dark bluish color is the 5 years included in the calculation for the year 2012. Okay? Kind of makes sense. I mean, the numbers don't matter so much yet, but we do all the data to get an average so that we can average the averages and then roll those averages into the year that would follow the end of the block of the same color. So 2009 would use the prior 5, 2010 would use the prior 5, and so on. And it's for each crop, and again on an acre-weighted basis, a rotation-weighted basis annually. So that looks real simple, right? We do that for each of the crops. I just put the top 3 that matter. Wheat matters a little bit, so you can see what happens. So take a look at the last 5 years. Now look at the previous 5 years. What's going to happen when we drop off 236 and add 613? Okay? So sometimes this averaging process starts with a block. We get an average, 362 looks like it's in the middle of that. 437 looks like it's in the middle of that, but it's still a rather substantial change even in the average because simultaneously we dropped off the smallest and added the biggest. Okay? So what's corn going to be this year? So most farmers will get 550. Chris has already sold 4 years at 825. But it's definitely not going to be 362, or we don't expect it to be 362. And if it is 362, it's because you grew 285 bushels, right? So this average we expect to continue to increase for some period of time for the major crops, for the ones that really matter. And corn and soybeans dominate the process because the rotational shares are so high for corn and soybeans. You add the 57 and the 48 together, and you've got 105% of the stuff that matters. So that will help explain some of the things you'll see going forward. Okay, what about the cap rates? And again, 641 was not technically a published number from an Internal Revenue Service IRB. They put out bulletins. This one was never released as a bulletin until the following year, but it was used in the calculation. So these, again, because they also average through time, don't move as quickly as yield curve issues might suggest. So a lot of you have, myself included, refinanced at a much lower rate recently in order to take advantage of the really low yield curve situation. And I look at this and I say, mortgage rates aren't 6.5. There's no way. Well, mortgage rates aren't marginally, but the average over the period of time that this average is calculated, which is also a slowly moving average, are in fact 6.4. That will go down next year quite a bit. When you reduce the cap rate, you increase the capitalized value. Divide by a smaller number, the ratio goes up. So again, the directional effect of this will suggest upward pressure to what we would expect for assessed values. Costs are the compensating item here. They're going up, but maybe the average cost isn't going up as fast as average return is going up and cap rate effects are going down. Okay. First bullet point I've somewhat discussed, again, the operated acre records are important so that we can associate particular cost data with the particular line in the FBFM system that gets us to an answer. So you take, and again, this is the shortest math I can think of to use, the yield for corn at that location at that date, times the price of corn at that location at that date, times the share of corn at that location at date. Same thing for soybeans, same things for all the other crops. You add all that together, right? So at each point in time, you come up with this weighted amount of income generated by each crop at that particular point on the PI scale, and you get a bunch of stuff. So we have, as I said, 12 to 13,000 of these calculations at the farm level to do with a lot of crops. It comes up with some variation still, and we need a way of summarizing that. Again, the non-land costs are not allocated at a crop level, so at the level of all the crops generated, we can find the cost really accurately. For the particular crop, we don't need to. We put the gross together across crops before we subtract the non-land cost across crops. And then the land return, this LR, is the thing we'll focus on for the remainder. And the test isn't until noon, so the land return is calculated as gross minus non-land costs. There's lots of ways in the accounting world to get to that number. We do what we think is the best using FBFM data and the way the law requires us to do it. But that still says we have more land returns than we have SPIs. So a farm in Woodford with a 120 PI generated a 318. 120 down in Edgar generated a 321, which is the right one. So we need some way of averaging also at each of the observations that have a similar PI. Okay? And again, remembering that these are stacked 5 years. So here's effectively, without all the dots, the idea that comes about from this. So for each of the soil PIs, we have a whole pile of observations that are the result of subtracting the value at that particular PI for that farm, and its non-land cost reduced gives us a dot. And then each of these dots is used to come up with the function, that straight line stretched through the dots, that relates soil productivity to the final land return. Let's see, I'm not sure if there's a whole lot we want to say here. We have debated, how many, Brenda, give me an estimate of the number of hours we've debated all the alternate versions of this, and they all agree. So we've calculated this particular number in at least 4 separate ways that I can think of, and it's always the same number. It doesn't matter how you get to it, it turns out to be the same number. We can average across time first and use a single price, it doesn't matter. You can average across the soils in a particular county first, it doesn't matter. You can look at a different definition of the non-land cost, it doesn't matter. You can use cash rent analogs to some parts of this, it doesn't matter. These are really stable relationships in the middle of the range. What you notice is that really low PIs, some people plant strawberries and their accounting data just don't show much cost, so when you take the gross, which is available for the rotations, subtract the cost they actually had, it turns out to look like they had more income than. So, okay, that's fine, you're a really clever operator. You planted asparagus in the corners, I don't care. It doesn't matter, the amount you can generate for farm use would have been this, if you'd planted the rotations we expected. And this relationship turns out to be extremely stable. So we test every year also to say what caused a change, and I do think this one is important to appreciate at some level. It's hard to look at the scale and really understand how much that matters because we haven't even applied the 10% limit yet. But every time you have a change, because it comes about from changes in a lot of things. The gross changed because of the average prices changing. The cap rate changed because of cap rates changing. All these other things that changed, it's hard to say, did it go up because prices went up? That's the #1 question we get. My assessments went up and my price window didn't. Why? Well, cap rates went down. Or the period of time dropped off a 2 and added a 6, or whatever it is. So we always decompose it and say, if we took the previous time period and previous rate, so last year, and then we took the previous time period but the new cap rate, just changing the cap rate, this is 010 to 011, increases the assessments by that much. So on a pure just if the cap rate changed argument, we have this much change. And then we say, well, but in this time, if we had just the income effect and hadn't changed the cap rate, what do we get? We get the green line. Now if we do them all together, we get the purple line. So they don't add up, right? There's an interaction effect. We do that every year, we keep track of it through time, and honestly, it's just clean. We've done this all the way back to 2003, and they just have kind of slowly bounced around and moved up as incomes have moved up slowly. Okay, so you're always supposed to pause in the middle of a story and say what you just said, right? So on one slide that may have saved us 20 minutes, the gross is calculated using rolling average income potential for each SPI, given the rotations, the prices, and the yield functions. Clear? We come up with a gross potential that should reflect, given the average practices, the average prices, and the average yields, how much income that acre should have been able to create. Particular behaviors around that are summarized in the average. Yeah. That land return for each point in time, for each operator I, and at each point on the SPI scale, is then calculated using each of these grosses minus the land cost for each operator at each point in time. Okay, so that's the hard thing. I mean, math is hard. It's supposed to be. I keep telling my 10-year-old that. It's really a good way to keep track of the details, though, and if I get hit by a bus on the way out of the building, the next person who picks us up will get the same numbers. That's the important part. Okay? So this is FBFM data based to come up with a land return that we get rid of all of these subscripts, all that variation in that one chart we saw, by regressing or by